Welcome everyone to CG webinar seminar number 306, but more to the point, the third of our 4 webinars on higher education and knowledge in Latin America. And today we're going to talk about internationalization and student mobility in Latin American higher education. And our speakers are Kyria Finardi is listed first, and Guzmán Valenzuela is listed second, but I'll introduce those two in a moment. First, let me take you through the webinar protocols. Now, remember that we're being recorded, so your statements, your wisdom's in the chat, and then online will be available through YouTube for the online webinar itself and our website for the chat statements. Now, during the webinar, please keep yourself muted unless you've been asked to speak or ask a question. We find that extraneous noise picked up by people's microphones can disrupt the webinar. And you don't need to have your video on during the webinar either, but we'd like you to turn it on when you come into the Q&A and ask a question. We recommend using speaker view in the top right-hand corner there so you can more clearly see who is talking. Now, to ask a question, to enter our Q&A segment, which is an important part of the webinar, write your question out, or if it's not a question, a statement, write your statement out in the chat. And on the basis of what's coming in the chat, we then select people into the Q&A itself. Now, normally, if your comment or your question are relevant to the webinar and you come in fairly early, you get into the Q&A. If you come in late, like 5 or 10 minutes before the end, you might miss out. So do make sure you're there early. When you're invited into the Q&A, I'll send you a little message from the chair saying that we're going to bring you in. When you are called in over the sound, you unmute yourself. Most important to unmute yourself. Switch on your video, and then you tell us who you are and where you're from, and then you make your statement or ask your question. Now, it's a pleasure to introduce our 2 speakers. Kyria Finardi is a senior lecturer in the Department of Languages, Culture and Education, and a researcher in the postgraduate program of education of the Federal University of Espírito Santo in Brazil. She was the president of the Brazilian Association of Applied Linguistics, co-founder and the coordinator of Ibero-America Association of Applied Linguistics, vice president of the International Association. Very nice to have you with us, Kyria. Your first engagement in CG and in our webinar program. Very, very welcome. Kyria Guzmán Valenzuela is more familiar, I think more well-known to our webinar watchers. She's been here before. She chaired the last webinar, and she's in the Faculty of Education at Universidade de Tarapacá in Chile. Her research focuses on neoliberalism and its impact on universities, the public-private distinction in higher education. You can never get away from that in Chile. That's almost everyone I know in Chile is working on public-private issue. And the North-South divide in global knowledge and its influence in the sector. So really good to have you both. I guess we're going to start with Kyria. So can I hand the screen to you at this point?
Thank you very much, Simon. It is a pleasure to be here. I hope it's not the first, but the opportunity to engage with these conversations and seminars. Let me see if I can share my screen. Trevor, for some reason now, when I try to share again, I get the same message. The PowerPoint is not open. Can you do that for me?
Yes, I can, no problems.
Yeah, we've had that problem with a few webinars, actually.
Yeah, and we tried it before and it worked. And now when I'm trying, it doesn't work. Thank you, Trevor. So as you can see from the title of this talk, I was invited to talk a little bit about internationalization and student mobility, focusing on student mobility in Latin America. This is what I'm going to try to do. Next slide, please, Trevor. And without further ado, so as to make the most of the time we have here, I want to start this conversation by calling your attention, raising your awareness to the fact that internationalization has for some time now been equated and seen as a synonym to mobility. And I think that this is a concept and the view that we have to question and reflect a little bit about. Even though Hans de Wit and Jane Knight, more than a decade ago in 2011, have warned us about the dangers of looking at internationalization as an equivalent to mobility, as a myth or misconceptions as put forward by those two authors. And so ever since this warning more than a decade ago, we've had some proposals for alternative approaches and views of internationalization, such as, the critical view, internationalization at home, ethical or sustainable internationalization, inclusive or intercultural internationalization, just to name a few. Next, please, Trevor. And so, although we see that it is difficult or it is not desirable to look at internationalization as being an equivalent to mobility, it is still very much so the way a lot of universities have understood and practiced internationalization. And this is because the numbers of mobility are in the increase. As you can see from the latest report that we have here, in international mobility, and this was, of course, before the pandemic, was in the increase. We had about 800,000 in 75, and then this increased to 4 million. 2013, 6 million in 2019. And so in less than 50 years, we can see an increase of 7 times in numbers of student mobility. So we can predict that by 2025, the number of students in academic mobility worldwide will reach 8 million. So a considerable figure. Next, please, Trevor. Of course, if we look at mobility in Latin America and the Caribbean and in the Global South, this is going to be somewhat different because at the global level, the total displacement of higher education international students moved from around 2 to 2.3. That is from 4 to 5 million in just 5 years. But this increase in the region, that is in Latin America and the Caribbean, has been much, much smaller, from 1.09 to 1.14, so not a considerable increase, or in figures from 200,058 to 312,000 students. So this is the second region in the world with the lowest increase in mobility, academic mobility. That is quite different from the increases we have seen in countries in Central Asia, for example, where the volume has almost doubled. Southeast Asia is one of the cases where it has tripled. Next, please, Trevor. And of course, when we talk about mobility, we have to consider not only the numbers and the flows, but also what this represents. And critical decolonial authors suggest that perhaps students have been seen as cash cows and as ways of or strategies for universities to finance their higher education. And if we consider this and consider the warning given by Adriana Dias, who in 2018 said and showed us that the current higher education landscape was characterized by a strong Anglophone asymmetry in which only 4 countries, US, UK, Australia, and Canada, concentrated more than 50% of the students abroad, that is of international students. And this continues even after the pandemic. We can see that there is a strong correlation between languages and also mobility. Next slide, please. Of course, this changed a little bit in 2020 with the pandemic. Which imposed physical restriction measures that interrupted physical mobility. And by interrupting physical mobility, especially to those 4 countries that concentrated more than half of the international students in the world, many universities had to switch to virtual mobility. And this has represented considerable change in the landscape of mobility in higher education. Next, please, Trevor. As we can see in these two studies that were carried out and written in our research group in Brazil, the pandemic brought a paradigm shift for academic mobility, especially for the Global South and for Latin America, in the sense that many universities who could not engage in academic mobility because of economic or other types of resources were able to engage in global conversations through virtual mobility. And so many universities of the Global South and Latin America were included, and many other languages as well, not only English. And so this represents a paradigm shift in the sense that there is a lot more inclusion and active conversation with the Global South. Just for you to have an idea, the numbers or the percentage of academic community in Europe, for example, the students that can engage in physical academic mobility before the pandemic was around 5%. In Brazil, less than 2%. At UFES, my institution, less than 1%. And so we can see that the physical academic mobility is a very exclusive activity, one that reaches less than 98% of the academic community, whereas virtual exchange and virtual mobility represents a way to include more people in this scenario, more people, more voices, and as we're going to argue, more languages as well. Next slide, please, Trevor. So we can think and ask ourselves whether, this virtual mobility has represented an ecology of knowledges and languages, because now we have more players, more knowledges being seen, and more languages being played. Next, please. These are some questions that we're going to discuss. And we can also ask ourselves whether this inclusion of more players, languages, and students has represented more cooperation as opposed to more competition. In a study, in this study that was carried out in Brazil, analyzing the two major academic mobility programs in Brazil, the Science Without Borders, which is an outbound academic mobility program, and the PEC-G, which is an inbound academic mobility program, concluded that unfortunately, competition is still stronger than cooperation, not only in academic mobility, but internationalization in the South and in Brazil, as analyzed in these two programs. And so perhaps this paradigm shift hasn't really impacted on cooperation, but we hope it will. Next slide, please. Considering Brazil, and just to give you some numbers, I know we are going to talk about Latin America, but since Brazil is leading not only the production, but academic mobility in Latin America, I thought it was important to show you some numbers. It is not only the 12th largest economy, the 6th largest country in terms of population, with the 5th largest territory, but we speak the depending on how you look at it, the 5th most spoken language in the world. And yet, next slide, please. Despite the fact that we have an international, very global language, we could say, we can see that Brazil represents only 1% of the academic production, and only 20% of this is indexed in the basis. And although we have the 13th position for the production of academic knowledge in the world, when it comes to citations, for example, or the validation of this production, we're going to see that we practically are non-existent. So the image of the book representing the iceberg is very representative of what happens in Brazil and in Latin America. We can only see the top, the tip of the iceberg, which is, what is visible in Latin America. Next slide, please. So we could think that perhaps this is affected by the language that we speak, since Brazil is the only Portuguese-speaking country in Latin America. But there is a prediction that Portuguese is going to be spoken by 500,000 people by the end of the century. This was the prediction made by Susana Catita from the CNSALP, which is connected with the Ibero-American State Report. And although Portuguese is the most spoken language in the Southern Hemisphere, next slide, please, we can see that it still doesn't make a difference in terms of including more languages and knowledges in this supposedly ecology. But we can ask ourselves, okay, what if we consider the role of Portuguese and Spanish, the two main languages in Latin America? Would this be more global, international? Would it make a difference? Since the two languages together reach almost 1 billion speakers in 4 continents in the world, and 11% of all the publications, though only 1% of those is actually in Spanish or Portuguese. And that is because 96% of Portuguese researchers, 91% of Mexicans, Brazilian Spanish, and 80% of Colombian, Argentinian, and Peruvian researchers publish only in English. Next slide. So we can see that although the Latin American publication, for example, and participation in internationalization and international conversations in the Web of Science, for example, is increasing, the languages of the region are decreasing from 24% in the last decade to 16% in Spanish. So while publications in English are increasing by 75% since 2010, the languages from 75% in 2010 to 84% in 2020. The inverted figure is happening with Portuguese and Spanish, so they are decreasing. Next slide, please. And the reason why I'm discussing the languages here is because, as you saw with Adriana's just comment, there is a relationship between internationalization, academic mobility, and the use of certain languages. And so we can ask ourselves, well, is it possible to have diversity in international linguistic diversity in internationalization of higher education and in academic mobility in particular? So we can ask ourselves whether Babel is like Ginsburg and Weber asked, whether it is a divine punishment or a heavenly gift, because we know that though diversity is very good in theory, in practice, it is very difficult to be enabled, and it is costly. Next slide, please. Just to give you an example, practical example of how this is not enacted, but how this happens in terms of countries and regions. Africa, although it has more than 30% of the world's languages and 15% of its inhabitants, we can see that this proportion between population and language diversity is inverted in Europe, for example, with only 4% of the world's languages and over 10% of the population. So we can ask ourselves, okay, who pays the bill for language diversity? Next slide, please. In the case of Iberoamerica and Latin America, we can see that it is a region which has a strong presence in internationalization, so much so that we have these figures. I'm not going to read all these numbers, but we can see that from the almost 1 billion researchers in Iberoamerica, 64 million are from Latin America. So the region, Latin America, is very important for higher education. And these researchers in Latin America, 70% of them are based or working in higher education institutions, which represent almost 4,000 in the region. Next slide, please. So we can see that the region of Latin America is very important, but perhaps because we haven't been able to have decolonial or critical perspectives on the view and practice of internationalization in that region, in the Global South, and specifically in Latin America. Next slide, please. We are going to see that our presence, relevance, and representation in internationalization and international conversations is almost inexistent. This is a map of the world and of the scientific production in the world. And as we can see, the Global South is practically invisible. South America, Latin America, practically, and Africa practically invisible. And this is because of the abyssal lines that produces this lost or invisible science, since 90% of all the publications in the Web of Science, for example, are in English, meaning that, you know, the rest is going to be invisible. Next slide, please. So it is important for us to have this critical decolonial view on internationalization practices and on mobility as well, so as to question this visibility versus relevance. Next slide, please. Also questions of trade-offs between having scientific impact and losing social impact, which is something that we have to consider when we think about the languages of higher education, because of course publishing in English would be important for scientific impact, but then at the expense of publishing works in the local languages that could affect social impact. Next slide, please. And so we can see that in Latin America, we are divided between, you know, the need to make a difference with impact factor and losing social impact, not only because of the languages, as we'll see, but also because of the ways and of the side of the abyssal lines in which our knowledge is produced and circulated. Next slide, please. And so we can ask ourselves whether the publish or perish only in English, and whether this is related to the flows not only of academic mobility, but also how internationalization has been practiced and seen in Latin America. Next, please. And so I leave you with these questions. I am aware that I've brought more questions than answers. If you have further questions that we are not able to ask, perhaps in this Q&A, I'll be more than happy to contact you here. Next slide, please, Trevor. There's also my email address, so I'll be happy to be contacted either in the Q&A or by this email and the website. Thank you very much. I hope I stayed in time.
Thanks, Kyria. I think we go straight to Carolina now.
Okay, so perfect. Thank you very much for this space to talk about internationalization and Latin America. What I am going to share with you today is a study that my team and myself conducted in Chile, although it's about the social sciences and in Latin America. So basically what I want to do here is addressing the issue of research collaboration as part of an internationalization trend, but with a focus on the social sciences and in Latin America. And I'm going to interrogate research collaboration, which usually has a positive connotation. And well, this is the article we recently published, and I'm basing my presentation on this article. So what we have here is a problem for the social sciences. Usually when we read papers about global sciences, the focus is on STEM disciplines because they have more impact, they produce innovation. As a result, these disciplines are more prestigious, they receive more funding, and usually they publish a large amount of papers in high-ranked journals and patents as well. While the social sciences are a bit relegated because they don't produce an immediate economic impact. Some will argue that they don't produce economic impact. They are context dependent, so usually they address a lot of specificities regarding context. Also in the social sciences, we found a tradition of single author papers. It's much more common to find single author books and papers compared with hard sciences. There is a big traditions of books, and this is so in Latin America. But in Latin America, we have the issue that has been addressed by my colleague Kyria about being invisible, because most of the publications are in Spanish and Portuguese, which are national languages. And so to some extent, we have a lot of publications, but they are relatively invisible, while publications in English are more visible. So I'm going to share with you some data to get a big picture about research collaboration in the social sciences in Latin America. What we did was, in the first place, identifying thousands of papers in the social sciences in two well-known databases. The first one is Web of Science Core Collection, and which is very prestigious, and I'm sure you are familiar with it. And then we identify papers in Cielo, which is an index that is very popular in Latin America, that was created in Brazil in 1997, but then it has become quite popular across Latin America and even in South Africa. The final sample was almost 100,000 articles in the social sciences. An important thing here is that these papers were authored by at least one Latin American author, or one author affiliated to a Latin American a university. So in this graph, you will see that in both indexes, Web of Science and Cielo, there is a spectacular increase in the number of publications, but especially for the social sciences. We also identify papers in the art and humanities, but I'm not going to focus on that. So you can see that if we look at the total of publications, the increase in the number of publications is really spectacular since 2002 until 2018. It is true that Brazil produces a lot, but Brazil is a huge country. So if we adjust the number of publications by million of inhabitants, we will see that at least in the social sciences, Chile is leading the publication, followed by Uruguay, by Cuba and Uruguay. And Chile is quite a small country, and that says a lot about policy research in the country. But well, I'm going to refer to collaboration because this is the focus of my presentation. I mentioned that single author papers were a very important feature in the social sciences in general. But in Latin America, you can see in this yellow line that the single author papers have been decreasing over time, while collaboration within a single country has been increasing, and also collaboration with countries outside LATAM. So broadly, what we can see is that single author papers are decreasing while collaboration is increasing. However, what is very striking and disappointing to some extent is that collaboration across countries in Latin America is quite low, and it has increased, but not very much. So this poses a lot of questions and reflections as well. When we think about the social sciences, we need to have a further look into specific countries, and you will see that we cannot treat Latin America as a unit. There are a lot of differences across country. So, for example, you can see that in the case of Brazil, in this kind of dark green color, you will see that Brazilian authors usually collaborate among themselves. So there is a lot of collaboration, but within Brazil. That means that Brazilian colleagues write together, basically. And then, for example, then you will see that in Venezuela, for example, there are most of the publications are single author publications rather than collaborative publications, and so on. I cannot, because of time restrictions, I cannot analyze each country, but I'm sure you have seen that in this purple color, you know, it starts increasing the number of publications, and that is collaboration outside LATAM. So you will see that the highest percentage of collaborative papers with colleagues outside LATAM are quite strong, quite high, the number of publications in the poorest countries in Latin America: Dominican Republic, Haiti, Panama, Guatemala, El Salvador, Nicaragua, Honduras, Bolivia. Yeah, so that says a lot about collaboration, and here I will bring some ideas about dependency theory as well. So the important thing here is that these patterns of publications in the social sciences in Latin America behave in quite different ways depending on the country. I mentioned that collaboration with colleagues outside Latin America has been increasing, and these are the most important collaborators countries. In the first place, the United States, although it has been decreasing over time, and that's quite interesting. And in the second place, Spain, followed by the United Kingdom, France, Germany, and Canada. The role of Spain is easy to explain because as Kyria mentioned, we share the language, so probably it's much easier to publish with colleagues in Spain. But then we have Anglo-Saxon countries, the United States, United Kingdom, and Canada, and there are we can explain this collaboration regarding the power exercise by Anglophone countries and the importance of English in publications. So very, very broadly, a summary of what I have presented here is, in the first place, a spectacular increase in the number of articles in the social sciences in Latin America in the last 2 decades, more or less. A decrease in the number of single author articles, and at the same time, an increase in the number of collaborative papers, and that says that it seems that the social sciences are changing these very important features of publishing by one author, and that is interesting. It seems that in the social sciences, Latin American authors are seeking more collaboration and more co-publications. There is a more domestic collaboration. That means that we tend to collaborate with colleagues within the same country, and that I would say that this is quite typical in the social sciences, but also in the humanities. We have found this in the literature. There is a striking and disappointing little collaboration across countries within LATAM. We could have expected that because we share a language, we would publish more with colleagues across Latin American countries, but that is not the case. While we collaborate more with colleagues who are outside Latin America. And well, as I mentioned, there are different patterns concerning countries, and probably the poorest countries have fewer resources to conduct research, and this is why they have to establish partnerships with colleagues in outside Latin America. And finally, I didn't show this data, but we didn't find, it was negligible, sorry, that word is very difficult for me, but it was almost absent, or there was very scarce collaboration with other countries in the South. So, for example, we don't collaborate with other countries in Africa. And that says a lot about collaboration and global trends. So these are my final remarks. In the first place, there are disciplinary imbalances. This is not only about geopolitical issues, about being part of the global South, but it's very important to take into consideration the role of the social sciences and how we compare the social sciences with STEM disciplines in terms of visibility, prestige, and power. In the second place, there are obvious geopolitical imbalances, and Latin America experiences this pattern of invisibility because of language issues, but I think that there are other issues that we can discuss during the QA time, but one is for sure language. These patterns and this double invisibility that the social sciences in Latin America experience are in part to be explained by the issue of publishing in high-ranked journals, the role of rankings and how they stratify higher education systems and universities across the world, and the ways in which these rankings boost stratification within academic work and what is more valuable and less valuable. And so I think, and I'm going to finish with this, I think as Latin American authors and academics, we need to not only reflect about this invisibility, epistemic invisibility in the production of knowledge in the social sciences. I think it's a good exercise to interrogate what is happening, why our publications are more invisible, or why these hegemonic narratives about world-class universities shape the knowledge production. But what we really need now is to produce spaces to change these practices and think about alternative possibilities for knowledge production, at least in the social sciences. Thank you very much.
Thanks very much, Carolina, and thank you, Kyria, as well. We have Leandro Rodriguez Medina in the already in the chat with a question for you, Carolina, but I might ask a couple of questions first, just to try and get things going a bit. We need some more Q&A questions in the chat. What about collaboration patterns in Spanish and Portuguese across the region? How does that compare with the pattern of intra-regional collaboration in English? You know, which countries in the region are particularly active in fostering Spanish or Portuguese language collaboration? Do many Spanish researchers work in Portuguese? You know, are there regional collaborations in Portuguese? And that's the sort of first question then, is about the non-English aspect, to compare that with the English aspect. And the other question is about the, you know, this interesting point about the decline of collaboration in US. What are the respective roles of North America and Latin and Europe, you know, vis-a-vis Latin America? I mean, what's the long-term trajectory there, do you think?
Regarding non-English publications and within the region, what we found is that there is very little collaboration with other colleagues in the same language, but in other countries in Latin America. Why is that? We can speculate. I don't have the answer for that, because what we found is that there is a lot of collaboration within a single country, and that means that we publish in Spanish and we collaborate, but with colleagues within the same country. And to be honest, I don't have the answer, but it's striking. What could think about national system, context-dependent science, and when we write about our context, and we don't find similarities with other contexts in Latin America. So I really don't know the answer, but there are a lot of publications in Spanish and in Portuguese. But when we look at collaboration, it is not across countries within Latin America. So it seems that we cannot fulfill Bolivar's dream about one Latin American unit collaborating, being part of this big Latin American project. The reason of that, to be honest, I don't know. And regarding the USA, we tried to find some explanations for this trend, and I think that one is that we found in other literatures that it seems that the role of the United States in terms of collaboration is not only decreasing for Latin American countries, but also for other countries around the world. So perhaps we are seeing here a decline in the hegemony of the United States. That could be one possibility. But also, we need to be cautious here because we only work with two indexes, Web of Science and Cielo. And perhaps if we consider Scopus, another very important database, the results would be a bit different. I think that Latin America is academics in the social sciences are opening possibilities to collaborate with other countries especially in Europe, I would say. And well, you saw Spain, for example, or Germany, or even France. So I think that we are opening the possibilities of collaboration with other countries other than the United States.
Thanks, Carolina. I think we'll bring in our questioners at this point. And the first one on my list is Leandro Rodriguez Medina. Leandro, can you come in, please?
Hi. Well, my question was, thank you very much first for the presentation and the opportunity to ask, but it was exactly the same about the US, the decline of the US. If you have any hypothesis, and I see you have one, which is a general decline of the influence of US social sciences. So now I would change a little bit. My question is, do you think there is a way to prove this decline of the influence of the US, not only in terms of authorships, co-author papers, but also in terms of the topics? You see the possibility of a kind of new agenda for social sciences in Latin America, given this, decreased influence of a hegemonic country like the US? Thank you very much.
Thank you, Leandro, for this very interesting question. To be honest, we need to go there and we need to analyze the content of the papers. We haven't started yet, but we are going to choose a sample and we are going to analyze the content of these papers. However, in previous studies, I have analyzed the methods, the contents, the theories, the citation patterns, and I would say that there are interesting issues there about citing, and at least in some disciplines in the social sciences, we tend to use a lot of theories that have been produced in the United States, in the UK, or in Europe. So that is a challenge, and it's something that we should do shortly. That is very interesting, your question.
Thanks very much for that, Carolina, and to Leandro. JB Mayer, you have the next question.
Yes, good morning, and thank you very much. When we look at the student mobility, and we can see that it remains very elitist and very selective, which is visible with the case of Europe. Even though there are programs like Erasmus, we can see that it's the social minority that has access to mobility, and internationalization at home does have a way. It's a promising way to enlarge this social access to mobility. Indeed, we can see it in the Argentinian case. It's very similar to the Brazilian one, with the COVID and pandemics has changed the pattern, the paradigm, and to a large extent, the work of Diego Carambula can be mentioned about that. To a large extent, there is a new access to internationalization through it. Second, the question of the social science and humanities in Latin America. So the answer has been given for the linguistic bias from the bases mentioned by, the databases mentioned by Carolina. Still, we can just think of, this is a region where there are lots of institutions for scientific cooperation, and it doesn't produce much of visible cooperation at the regional level. But isn't there a question of a prestige in this case, like to write an article with some authors from foreign countries, isn't it that it's much more prestigious to do it with either English-speaking countries or other countries from Western Europe? And isn't there then something which is at stake, which is a kind of recognition, scientific recognition, that implies that if you want to really make some international cooperation, you turn automatically to other countries than the ones of your own region? I think there is something which is tied to the working, the functioning of scientific communities at the regional level. Thank you very much.
Thanks for those excellent questions. Kyria, would you like to come in first?
Yes. Before I comment on the question you asked, Simon, about the cooperation and the role of Spanish, Portuguese, and English trying to connect these questions and with Carolina's answers, I'd just like to comment on this latest question with from J.B. Mayers, because he said that there's a lot of visible cooperation, but what happens with invisible cooperation? And I'd like to call your attention that we're talking here about publications, at least those that are visible, right? Because not all of them are. But of course, we have to consider that there's a lot of cooperation, the invisible cooperation that goes on between countries and languages that perhaps is not visible because it is not published. There are many other things that we do in higher education besides publications, and that of course are done in Spanish and Portuguese in Latin America with cooperation from those countries. But perhaps it is part of the submerged iceberg that I showed you. It doesn't show and we don't see it because it's part of the invisible science and cooperation that we do. I'm very happy to see here present, for example, authors like Lucia Cespedes, Ana Raquel Mendes, who have researched these issues in Latin America. In the case of Lucia Cespedes, for example, in her 2021 paper, she shows how, though we have countries and leaders in publications, for example, such as Brazil for a particular area in publications, this is unmatched by the role of languages in these publications and in the cooperations. And so I agree with Ana Carolina that it is not, sorry, I agree with Carolina. I agree that it is not only an issue of language, it is an issue of prestige and power, and with which countries we do the visible and the invisible cooperation. And perhaps this is something that we have to, following Carolina, interrogate and ask ourselves. Are we doing this? I saw that somebody included a question in the chat. I think it was Andrea, talking about the social impact in Latin America and how do we juggle between the need to have scientific impact and social impact as well. And I think one possibility would be, for example, to work more with the intercomprehension power of Spanish and Portuguese, the two main languages in Latin America, in the region. But of course, this would only be possible in the other activities that we do in higher education, in the cooperation, in the sort of invisible cooperation, but not in the visible one, because we wouldn't be able to publish papers in, Spanish and English together using intercomprehension in publication. Though we would certainly be able to use a lot more intercomprehension between those countries and researchers in the region. I'm not sure I've answered, Simon. And if there's any question that I should address, please let me know.
Caroline, do you want to add, particularly in relation to
Yes.
JB?
Yes, I wanted to mention to JB Mayer that I agree with you. There is the issue of what we call in Chile a strategic collaboration or a strategic cooperation. So I think in certain countries, there are very clear policies about who you should be working with. And there is the suggestion that it's more prestigious to work with countries in Europe or Australia and the United States. So that is for sure. So I think that policies, research policies are very important, and the ways in which countries are taking these internationalization trends and the ways in which these narratives, global trends and global narratives are put into a policy, and the ways in which these policies at the same time shape universities. And in Chile, for example, that is very evident, and we have conducted research around a lot of documents, policy documents, and we have found these narratives about prestige and a strategic collaboration. So that is for sure, and I totally agree with you. I think that also there is the issue of more regional policies that we need in Latin America in order to promote collaboration across countries within Latin America. I'm very aware that in Europe, you have the European Union and the Horizon program, for example, and those kind of policies, European policies, boost and promote collaboration across European countries. We have some policies like that, regional policies in Latin America, but we need to increase those kind of strategic collaborations within Latin America. I don't think that they have been very effective. And I think that we are in the need of those policies, because usually what we have in each country is policies that are very focused on a specific country. So Chile promotes has a national policy that is focused on Chile. It's not focused on the collaboration between Chile and other countries in Latin America. So I think we need more regional policies that help boosting this collaboration across Latin American countries. And finally, and in a very quick way, I will say that there are other indexes in Latin America that are rather invisible for the social sciences. One is Redalic, for example. The issue with Redalic is that there are a lot of publications in journals indexed in Redalic, but it's not very prestigious. So a lot of academics don't feel motivated to publish in those kind of journals because they don't receive rewards, or they feel that their publications are not visible. So there is a lot of stratification across indexes as well.
Thank you, Carolina. Our next question is from Andrea Detmer. Kyria has begun to answer Andrea's question, but let's give Andrea the chance to come in.
Hi, thank you very much, Professor. And thank you both for your presentations. Yeah, in fact, my question is related to this tension between scientific and social impact, related to what Carolina was just mentioning as well about the public policy of research. And specifically, I would like to know, well, if you could share your thoughts about what has been the responsibility of public policy, and specifically in funding research, in creating this kind of tension, and to what extent these specific types of publications, specific types of collaboration have been steered by public money in a way, and to what extent this needs to change in your views. Thank you.
I am confused. Is this for me or for Carolina or both?
In fact, at the beginning, I thought of it related to your point about the tension between both types of impact, but it's also, I mean, Carolina also touched upon the public policy side. So as you wish.
Perhaps we can both answer then about Brazil and Chile, because I know that there is a difference, and perhaps Carolina can correct me here if I'm wrong, but I understand that there's some kind of a financial reward in Chile for certain types of publication, whereas in Brazil, it's indirect. We researchers do not receive any kind of reward or financial support for publications, although there are indirect and induced policies, public policies in universities for that. To give you one example, the two main financing agencies in Brazil, CNPq and CAPES, for example, although they don't give reward for a specific publication in English or in a certain journal, most of their calls for public financing for research, you have to fill in a form which is in Portuguese and English. And so the fact that they're requiring Brazilian researchers who want to apply for reward or for support for their research with a form in English is an evidence of the type of support they're giving. A lot of universities also, they give you support for translation of your papers or for publication. They pay part of the publication charges only if this paper is published in English in an international journal of prestige. And so it is indirect in the case of Brazil, but very heavily, I would say, induced, trying to show and induced researchers to publish in English in certain papers and with collaborators from the global north. So less South-South collaborations. We don't have, like Carolina said, in Latin America, effective policies to stimulate collaborations in the South and publications in languages other than English in prestigious papers. Now, perhaps Carolina can talk about Chile.
Yeah, well, yes, you're right, Kyria. There are a lot of rewards, and we can receive like £3,000 for one paper in a Q1 journal, for example, Web of Science. I know it sounds a bit extreme, but it is real, is what happens in Chile. But regarding your question, Andrea, I think that there is an important tension there about publications, knowledge production, and social impact. And I think one way of addressing that issue is by promoting more open access policies. I think that Latin America has been has a very interesting tradition regarding open access publications. Cielo, for example, is an incredible index, and all the journals indexed in Cielo are open and are free. And that means that knowledge is a public good, and everyone can access. I don't know whether everyone can understand, but at least everyone can access those knowledges, and this is part of social impact. However, in most prestigious journals, these policies of open access, for example, are quite problematic for us because we have to pay a lot in order to make our papers available for everyone. And for example, I have seen that colleagues here in Europe their universities pay for this open access, but we don't have the resources to do that, and that really affects and make us our publications invisible. So I think that in order to answer your question, I think that, to me at least, in my view, open access as part of social impact can be and could be nicely addressed if there are more policies promoting this open access and at a more affordable in a more affordable way.
Yes, there's something quite Orwellian, isn't there, about open access having a huge paywall. You know, it's sort of like, you know, war is peace, freedom is slavery, open access equals $20,000 American paywall. You know, it's not quite what the words mean. And you know, it's outrageous the publication companies haven't negotiated different deals for countries with less resources. I mean, it's just excluding them. It's also outrageous that that countries and systems and institutions are advising people who to collaborate with on the basis of what country they come from and not what the knowledge is about. I mean, you know, there should be pushback against that kind of status-orientated advice about, you know, you should collaborate with people from certain places in order to advance your position or your project. I mean, that is appalling. But you know, I know that's the world we're in. But status is something you always got to interrogate, I think, when you're talking about knowledge. The last question is from William Machaka. William, can you come in, please?
Thank you, Simon, and thank you, Kyria and Carolina. Very interesting presentations. And based on what you mentioned during your presentations, I would like you to view some connections that might exist between what Kyria mentioned as a dichotomy between competition and collaboration in internationalization, and the research outputs referred by Carolina, mentioning that collaboration among Latin countries looks like shorter than the rest. So would you please be kind to share your views on that connection? And thank you.
I don't know whether I got the I got it right, but it's a connection between my what I said about collaboration within Latin America and Kyria's presentation.
Yes. I was trying. What I found is a connection between your both presentations. Kyria mentioned that there's this dichotomy in internationalization that is about this contrast between collaboration and competition. Whereas you remarked that collaboration among countries within LATAM tends to be low, no, in terms of research production. So would you see some kind of connection between those two points that you both mentioned? Thank you.
I think I need to think about it, but one possible connection will be that countries are more, at least Latin American countries are more focused on doing their own stuff. For example, Chile or Brazil, I have seen the amazing patterns of publications in Brazil, and they produce a lot, and they cite themselves in Brazil, and there is a big industry of publications. So perhaps we need, our national policies are more focused on promoting national science rather than collaboration, and I think that this is exactly what we need to address. We need more policies that promote collaboration, because probably each country is too much focused because of the international rankings pressure and these global trends. Perhaps each country is too much focused on their own stuff and producing and trying to be visible and trying to perform better in international rankings. And so we are missing the point of collaborating with our with our neighbors. I don't know, it's just on speculation, because I don't think I have the answer to your question.
Kyria, you've got the last word.
Well, I think that Carolina mentioned that we need more effective policies for South-South collaboration or intra or within region collaboration, and I agree. And I don't think the problem is only doing each country or each institution doing their own thing. I think we could be having a lot more collaboration if we had those policies in hand, because like I said, in these trade-offs between scientific impact and social impact, just to consider language in this dilemma, for example, if we always, a researcher writing in English from an Anglo-Saxon country probably would not have to choose between having scientific impact and social impact, which is something that we always have to do. We have to decide, okay, so who is going to read this paper? And like Carolina said, it's not only a question of languages, it is a question of open access and access itself to this. And so perhaps if we had more effective policies for collaboration, open science, and other types of collaboration, not only in publications, but in the regular activities that we do in laboratories, in teaching that we do in universities. Perhaps we could have more collaboration than competition. But the way I see it, William, right, who asked the question, the way I see it, William, in Latin America, I wouldn't say the Global South, but at least in Latin America, we're so busy trying to survive and keep our heads above the water in the tip of the iceberg that you saw, that it's very difficult to survive when most of your energy is being used up in surviving. And this is, I think, what we're doing. Perhaps once we have better conditions of work and more effective policies to guarantee more collaboration, we can think about what Simon said, you know, instead of thinking, why am I collaborating with this country just because, no, I'm collaborating with this particular university or with this particular country because the knowledge they have is interesting or is important to be shared, and not because I am induced because of a particular reward, for example, or prestige in my university. And so, unfortunately, the answer is we need lifesavers in Latin America, in the sense that we need to be able to do more than just keep our heads over the water. We need to live and not be so busy surviving, so as to be more collaborative and effective, I would say, in international scientific production. I hope I answered the question, William, and if not, be happy to continue this conversation through email or else.
Yeah. Wonderful, thank you.
How do we build endogenous agency? We build it collaboratively, collectively. You know, it's not an individual matter here. The tendency in publication, administration and organization is to think in terms of individual outputs, individual CV items and so on. But, you know, knowledge is naturally collective in the way it works anyway. And certainly knowledge researchers maximize their impact by working together in groups. It's really open and shut, isn't it? That, I mean, but if, you know, the knowledge, of course, isn't the thing which determines the collaboration. Collaboration also determines the knowledge. So, you know, by working with people in the same language group and regionally, you build different kinds of knowledge than you would if you're working with people across these sort of north-south boundaries, where the north often determines the topics and the agendas and so on. So, yeah, it's really straightforward in some ways. All the incentives ought to be loaded into endogenous cooperation, and then the impact globally will be much greater in the long term, you would think. But anyway, time will tell. It's been really great to have you both on the show, and you're welcome to come back with further research and further ideas in future. This Latin American higher education knowledge series is certainly paying dividends in terms of producing really good material on a YouTube site. I think you'll find that there's going to be a lot of people accessing today's discussion in the longer term. The final discussion in the Latin America series is epistemic injustice, decolonization, and the potentials of intercultural education. And that is happening on Tuesday next week. It's being led by the famous Catherine Walsh from Universidade Andina Simón Bolívar. And we really look forward to that climactic session, chaired by Alma Maldonado from Mexico. So that will be a very interesting occasion, I would think. So don't miss it. We look forward to seeing everyone there. And this is Simon Marginson saying thank you and goodbye for now.
Thank you. Bye-bye.